Conflicts are a part of our life. They cannot be avoided, they cannot be completely eliminated, but it is possible to live with them in a civilized and peaceful manner. In the podcast series called Conflict Matters, we talk about what conflicts can take away from us, but especially about what they can enrich us with if we are not afraid to think, listen to others, and discuss.
Conflict is often related to violence. Violence is something so ugly that we very often even refuse to talk about it. And yet the media, literature, computer games, and all the YouTube videos are full of violence, and we watch it and we are fascinated by it. So we will talk about violence in conflict today, but about various types of violence, not only the violence in a picture when somebody punch somebody in the face and the blood is everywhere in the film or in reality. We will talk about violence which is hidden in our regulations, in our laws, in our habits, in our smiles, in our language, and in our society. And we'll talk about nonviolence. And this is even more interesting because nonviolence as a superpower may be something very strange to you, but extremely interesting and powerful. So I have a wonderful guest who is our friend and colleague for several years already. Her name is Nadine Bloch, and she's famous not only in the United States, but all over the world as a trainer, facilitator, and activist. And she's living nonviolence through all her life. Welcome, Nadine.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here and speak with you again.
So let's talk about the violence as such at the beginning. How it is in conflicts or in social conflicts. We can start maybe from United States because it's always better for people in Slovakia to speak bad about Americans. Later on, we will speak bad about Slovaks as well. But on example of your own country, if we can show that there are really various phases of violence we can observe in society. So how it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you said, it's a really interesting topic because many of us think that in order to live fulfilling lives or to make our best shots, we have to avoid conflict, first of all. And in particular, it's, I think, the element of violence within conflict, like you said, that is very challenging. And so in the United States and all over the world, we face violence on many different levels, right? There's, at the very most obvious, there's physical violence, assault. Some people also consider destruction of property violence, which we can talk about a little later. Some of us do not consider that violence. And then there's emotional violence and verbal violence. And some might argue even visual violence, things that you see that are oppressive or harmful. And so in our particular society in the United States, we are in an interesting place where during the pandemic, there was an increase, one would say, of different kinds of violence, a result of pent-up rage or restriction, or the fact that we had to confront something out of our control. I think that often is what triggers violence. And then we also have overall, in the last few decades, last 30 or so years, a decrease of violence in the society that's been documented by the authorities in some way. Although we are a very litigious or fighting society, we have an enormous number of guns. And so a lot of the violence that is perpetrated with people who have these weapons is very effective in really hurting or killing other people. So I don't know exactly where you want to take it.
I mean, we normally in Slovakia, we imagine America as a country where everybody has a gun and where almost every day there is some shooting in a school or some public place. Is it really like this, or is it a little bit not complete picture?
Yeah, the United States is huge. Let's just be really clear. Some of our individual states are bigger than multiple countries, whether it's just by landmass or by sheer volume, numbers of people. We are an extraordinarily huge and diverse and geographically tremendous country, which both is a pro and a con. So there's not a one size fits all, unless we are a country that has an immense number of weapons, of guns, compared to other developed countries. And that is very true for across the country. We do, especially right now, following the shootings in California at a farm workers gathering spot and at a dance club in an Asian community. And of course, in schools, some of us feel that we are just one step away from a violent gun incident. And while this is, you could argue it's somewhat true, it is not the daily life of ordinary people in the United States, across the United States. It still is an exceptional event, although we are numb to the horror of it in some ways. So the United States, like Slovakia, like many countries, is made up of people who are very healthy, emotionally well-established, compassionate people who would like to achieve resolution of conflict in nonviolent or peaceful or appropriate means without doing harm to each other, as well as some people who I would have to say are emotionally or psychologically not healthy, and who have access to weapons that is unusual in a lot of other parts of the world, and then are able to carry out their unhealthy or psychologically harmful plans on people.
Yeah, but the acceptance of weapons is something which is in your culture because you have it in the Constitution as a right, that every person in America has the right to have a gun and to use a gun for his or her protection. So this is very different from our understanding in Europe. So it's like acceptance of having a gun. And of course, there is a saying that every gun fires once it will be used. So this is something maybe very different from how we understand it. We are much more scared of guns as such.
Well, this is true. And there are plenty of people. I will relay just a very short story. We had an armed robbery incident in the little community that I live in. We had a meeting with our police force and the elected officials, and many police came to that meeting with ordinary citizens. And one of my neighbors came to me afterwards and said, I felt so unsafe in that gathering because there were so many armed police officers. And in fact, many of us understand in the United States, across the United States, that more weapons make us more unsafe rather than safer. And even the police, right? If you talk to police, they will say the fact that there are so many guns on the streets makes it less safe for them to do their job as well. I will say that the Second Amendment has been widely misconstrued from when it was proposed and when it was instituted to now. It doesn't mean that every person in the United States is allowed to have an automatic assault weapon on their person. We have a number of laws. We have a very divided country at the moment between Republican and Democrat in particular. It's a generalization, but an understanding of what kind of controls need to put in place on what weapons so that everyone doesn't have access to these murderous and out of the ordinary weapons. In particular, the Second Amendment talks about a well-regulated militia, and that is not what we're talking about with an individual right to bear any kind of arm that you want. And so we are seeing a lot of controls put on this. And I think it does come down to an understanding, as you said, that the culture itself needs to be addressed on how it is acceptable or unacceptable to negotiate and make change in the world, how to deal with conflict, and how to deal with issues that you have with your neighbors.
Yeah, and this brings us to the other forms of violence, not only the one which is really like visible and which we watch in movies, that people are shooting at each other or punching or killing or whatever, physically harming each other. But there are maybe forms of violence which are less visible on the first sight. And a Swedish sociologist, Johan Galtung, was talking about structural violence, which is like enrooted in the system, in the laws and in some regulations, and also about cultural violence, which is like in our culture, in our habits, And for me, an example of cultural violence is, for example, an advertisement for a chainsaw with a naked woman, which is absolutely chauvinist and bad image of a female body used for advertisement of something which is absolutely not connected with a woman naked, which is very harmful for women, for, culturally harmful. So can you comment on this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And Galtung, of course, talk about the structural cultural aspects of violence. And while I was talking about guns, I think one of the biggest purveyors of violence in the United States right now are the police forces, which have become terror gangs. And this is part of the structural violence, the structural history of these police forces, which were often set up originally to enforce the slave trade and to enforce the racial and capitalist system that drove the slave trade in our country. And so the historical implications of that are still playing out today. And the structural violence of a system that prioritizes profits over people, that continues to, for example, in the US, we have to fight and struggle to get childcare to be provided for the poorest of us in the communities. We have to fight to make sure that everyone is housed, to make sure that everyone has access to good schools, to make sure that people have healthy food. We are not a country that is very high on the list of those that take care of everyone in their society. We instead have structural violence integrated into our system that we need to expose and overcome. We need to make the invisible structural violence and the cultural violence visible so that we can actually change it. And whether it's sexism or racism, homophobia, ageism, these things are all in a way limiting our potential as compassionate and successful humans. So this is a really big challenge.
I'm afraid we have something in common, Slovaks and Americans, which I am not actually proud of, this particular feature. And this is this belief that when you are not well off, when you are poor or you are marginalized, this is your fault. And you are to be blamed for that. And this is your responsibility to help yourself out. And if you are not able to do it, it's your fault and you should be like morally punished by the society. And this is something I think we have in common, and this is not a very nice thing we have in common, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And, some of it comes from the history of the United States and the belief that, there was the possibility to be a self-made man.
Yeah.
And I use the term
everybody
man.
can be successful. It's just a matter of that you have to work hard enough. And when you are not successful, that means you are lazy. You are failed.
Right. And we know that this is not true and that the deck is, or the cards are stacked against you, right? That in fact, these structural or cultural violence pieces are actually the things that hold you back and allow people to step on others at the bottom of the pile on their way up. And I think that that is part of the wrestling with that has to be done, particularly, and we were hopeful at the beginning of the pandemic that folks would understand that a global pandemic means that you have to bring everybody along with you on the path to healing. And we did see some of it, but not in any way enough to actually account for the terrible health costs of the pandemic or the economic inequalities, the structural violence that has really limited access to healthcare and other services.
Yeah, because when you are Black or you are born in a poor community, it's extremely difficult to get out. And without systemic approach, it is, in your country and in our country, many people think that, okay, let's charities deal with it. And maybe better to erase these people in general because they are so stinky and they are not beautiful enough, right? So that it's the problem of somebody else. This is for me like a showing of something which is really cultural violence. But just one more thing, that when it is happening to some other people, like these blacks, whatever that means, but when suddenly it's linked to my own family, to my parents, because you were mentioning ageism, this is something interesting, because ageism it may hurt anybody, even relatively middle-class people.
Absolutely. It's true. And, the bigger picture here is a frame of something we call solidarity, not aid. Like, how do we actually work as allies or accomplices even to bring those who've been marginalized to a place where they can lead their own success stories, right? Or maybe that's even too much of a condescending way to say it, but to support those who are working on this path, to follow their leadership in this. And solidarity, not aid, even as an NGO, as an organization working in this field, to recognize that sometimes we're unaccountable and we step into gaps where governments are not fulfilling their needs and the NGOs are not elected or in any way accountable to the people, and often provide services that then they don't have to take leadership from the community that they're serving, for example. And so this is all a different kind of violence, if you will, the violence of not listening to those you're working with, the violence of not actually taking into account the world that they want to see rather than the world that you want to see, and the violence of the bigger vision of having a future that includes everyone in a healthy and functioning community. And if we don't include everyone, there's inherent violence in that vision.
Yeah, you're touching a very important point, that when charities or people who have money, or they have even very good will to help the others, but once they are not held accountable, we have many examples of millionaires all around the world who are helping, or they think they are helping people or countries or communities. But it's a good question, what kind of vision they are imposing, in what kind of vision of well-being they are imposing on those whom they are helping, because very often they don't ask what these people really want, what kind of happiness they would like to have. And this is something what I remember when I was in Afghanistan, when local women, for them, the happiness was to be able to give birth healthy way, to have access to female healthcare provider, to feel safe and not be worried about every other child, that they can die and the children are dying as well. But many organizations from Europe and the US, they were trying to impose the female equality and feminist principles, very harsh, which were difficult for them because the society was not prepared for such radical reforms taken for the weak part of the society. I mean, as for the social status. So it did make a lot of harm to those women who were objects of this kind of programs.
Right.
So probably you have also similar examples in the United States.
Oh, there's plenty, right? And so, I mean, I guess this is why many people have come to the realization that to fight this structural violence, to fight this cultural violence, the solution is to use what we call, strategic nonviolent action, because we want to recognize that the state or the authorities or those in charge have unlimited access to violent retribution, whether it's structural, whether it's economic, whether it's cultural, or whether it's actual physical violence and weapons. And that in order to take that on, people need to organize and build their community strength so that they can win without resort to violence, so that they can actually put in place this future.
Yeah, but before we go to the strategic action or public action or community organizing, I would ask once again, what do you think? The violence in society, is it always wrong? Because somebody may argue that, okay, nature is full of violence, right? The animals are killing each other and natural world is full of death and full of violence. So why we are so much against violence? Maybe it is natural, isn't it?
So that's fascinating. I think that the issue here is one of maybe scale and one of the difference potentially between those who can think and be, I hate to use the word rational, or think or thoughtful and compassionate about what they do. And we do see plenty of examples in nature also of compassion and altruism and all that.
Yes.
And when we look at the ecology or the environment, we see that a sustainable community is a resilient community where many parts rely on many other parts to function. That if you pull on, one thread of an ecosystem, it does have repercussions elsewhere, but hopefully there are multiple layers of things that can respond so that it can heal itself and continue to function. And, violence, I mean, we have to admit that violence is very good at some things. It's very good at destroying or killing. And sometimes, whether you're looking at a fire in nature that needs to sweep through a forest that has evolved to have seeds that only germinate after they've been heated to a certain temperature, there are likely great comparisons to that with some activities that humans do. But there are also great warnings for that. And perhaps we have not evolved in that way, that we are not best served by being heated up to that point and changing in that way. We know, though, that if we look at conflict, not so much violence, that conflict is a necessary part of our human existence, and learning to resolve conflict in ways that are least harmful to those involved can be very helpful for the community on the long term. And so conflict, or, in this right now, we're dealing with a lot of polarization. I know Slovakia is, the United States is. And one thing that we find from times of great polarization is that there's a lot of interesting exchange happening. So people have compared it to someone who works with iron, and they have to heat the iron up in a forge before it is soft enough that you can actually make changes. And so the moment of polarization is that time when it's very hot and there are potential changes that could happen. And we, those of us who think that we can move to a healthier, more peaceful society, need to be ready for those times so that we can help direct the changes in a way that results in a less violent, less harmful situation for more people. And that's really the kick. Like, it's not that we're going to get rid of conflict or violence, most likely, but we can help people, respond in more appropriate ways.
Yeah, but next to our borders, we have a very violent conflict in Ukraine. And you also have many examples of violence on your southern border. But anyway, sometimes people think that all this nonviolent ideology, that this is something naive, what some activists only believe in, that real change, real social change is happening just when you have enough guns, enough power, enough soldiers or armed police, and then you can make a real systemic change in a country. What would you say to this?
Well, we don't have that belief, and we actually have data to back up the other side, which is a groundbreaking study from now quite a number of years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Two women researchers, academics, looked at the number of campaigns that were waged to make change, big changes. Maximalist campaigns are called, overthrowing governments and getting rid of regimes. And they found, looking at about 100 years of these violent and nonviolent campaigns, that violent campaigns were half as effective as the nonviolent campaigns. So nonviolent campaigns were twice as effective at making the long-term change they were trying to make as campaigns, which is a remarkable piece of information. And some of us, grew up thinking intuitively, if we use means that are not violent to make change, then it would make sense that the result would be less violent and more peaceful, because we would have practiced what we did, because it would, we'd try out different things. And that intuition has been backed up by data, so that we now have the information that, in fact, neither violent campaigns or nonviolent campaigns are completely successful, right? They both have an incredible failure rate. But nonviolent campaigns are successful about 55% of the time, and violent campaigns are only successful about half of that, about 27% of the time.
Yeah,
And
so we will make a link on this study in the description of this podcast. One of the authors is Professor Erica Chenoweth, and it's really wonderful. I think they studied something like 100 years in various countries all over the globe, many case studies of violent and non-violent campaigns. That means wars or violent revolutions on one hand, and non-violent movements or revolutions on the other hand. And that's really fascinating study.
yeah, and Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan are the two authors of the book Why Civil Resistance Works. Civil resistance is another name for people power or nonviolent resistance, and a very interesting work. It also, one of the other really interesting findings on this, which was very much supported and welcomed by the community that believes in nonviolent resistance and people power, was that it didn't take 100% or even more than 50% of the people to make this change. It took an active involvement of about 3.5% of the population in most cases to make this change. In other words, all the work, the campaigns that they looked at that had an active involvement of 3.5% of the population were successful. And there's one other really interesting piece I'll add, because it relates to how we perceive our work long term, and that even those campaigns that failed, even those nonviolent campaigns that failed, when they looked at them 5 years later, 10 years later, they were 35% more likely, I believe it was, to be successful in 5 years or 10 years, because the community had practiced and had learned ways of implementing the nonviolent resistance. And so that's very important to consider as well.
Yeah, I would maybe mention one more aspect, which I also have read in the study, or I have listened to some podcast with Erica, so maybe it was there, that nonviolence is inclusive, and it's much more getting people in, that violent campaigns, they attract just people of certain kind, people who are not afraid of violence and are ready to risk their lives and their families and many things, which is not absolutely wrong. Yet there are situations like, again, we are looking at Ukraine at the moment. Of course, it is necessary that some people are ready to fight for their freedom with arms. But these nonviolent campaigns, and there are also plenty of them in Ukraine, they can involve mothers, children, teachers, variety of personalities and professions, and old people, and they are much more inclusive.
This is another thing I would say. We should define the difference between nonviolence as a moral or ethical or philosophical way of life and strategic nonviolent action, which is actually what we're talking about now, the use of these strategic nonviolent action techniques and tactics to make change. It doesn't mean you believe in nonviolence in your whole life, but it means you understand the effectiveness of banding together with people. And so they find that there's a low bar to entry. In other words, many more people can join a nonviolent action campaign. They're usually about, I think, 11 times larger than a violent campaign, which would attract, like you said, often young people, often young men willing to take up arms. Whereas we call nonviolent action campaigns, we describe them as resourceful or resourcefulness, like, because everything can be part of this campaign. Whereas the violent campaigns are almost resourcelessness. You just only need a weapon, and that's what all there is, basically. And I would say, too, about Ukraine and being in the situation you're in, so close to the borders, on the border and one side, right, is that at some point, though, there has to be a conversation about the investment in death and dying and destruction versus the investment in a future that would be alive and healthy and constructive. And so there is a need to talk about negotiation. There's a need to talk about, and this is a very possibly unpopular thing, or has been in the United States, for me to say, it is very clear that the US and NATO is at fault with some of the aggression that drove Russia to do this horrible thing of attacking Ukraine. I'm going to condemn Russia as well as condemn war generally, because it doesn't lead us to a place where we're investing more in people's lives. We're investing instead in death and destruction. And so we need to really think about what it looks like to end the war and how we can rebuild and how people can have dignity in this world and security and safety to rebuild on a platform that recognizes perhaps, the issues around fossil fuel extraction or particular extractive practices for gold and other elements that are often at the base fueling these wars of resource.
Yeah, because on one hand, we are condemning Russia or other authoritarian regimes for violence, but at the same time, we are very sensitive on price levels of fuel in our cars, and we don't think that we are actually contributing to that violence by our consumption ways, by our way of life. And that this is also a kind of structural violence we are involved in. But my thinking is about how much me as an individual, when I believe in nonviolent methods of resolving conflicts or behaving in conflicts, am I really so powerful as an individual?
Yes and no. So really this matters, right? The things that we do in our individual daily lives definitely ripple out. Like there's no doubt about it. Even something as little as going to the store and saying hello and smiling to everyone you meet, we know inside of us that that has a ripple with how we interact. Will that change the world by itself? No, without a doubt, it will not. So going back to our earlier moment when we were talking about structural and cultural violence, it behooves us. We are called on in our lives, not just to do the things in our daily life, whether they're smiling at storekeepers or whether they're trying to drive less, to use less fossil fuels, to put less of an impact individually on this system that's fueling the war, but also to take it up on every level in our schools, in our communities, in our states, in our nations, in our global understanding of what the parameters are that drive violence and that drive these unhealthy relations. And in particular, we look at the climate and we look at what climate chaos will, the violence that rising seas and changing weather patterns will have on farmers and the communities that rely on them for food. We are intricately connected to that. And sometimes it's very hard to see that. So what we say is that we need to do what we can in our personal lives. We need to do what we can in our community and national lives. And then we also need to contribute big picture to understanding and making visible the structural violence and the cultural violence that allows individuals to not do what is necessary to change. So, as a white person in the United States, one of my jobs is to talk to my white relatives and help them understand the impacts of violence, help them understand why it's not okay to vote for an authoritarian racist like Trump. Help them. It's my job to talk to them. It's not the job of my good friend who's an African American or Latina to talk to my cousins who vote for Trump. It's my job to change them personally. And that is a personal thing that I can do. And it also affects my national politics and perhaps has ripples outward. And so one by one, we need to make these choices. And I also recommend whenever possible, not stopping there, right? Making the connections of the policies that we put in place to what drives the war in Ukraine, for example. And so it is much more important for all of us. It's a exponentially of increasing importance for us to do this kind of thinking and to make visible the underlying causes of things that we're involved in.
Yeah, but it is very difficult during the war or even discussing a war without polarization. Because when, even in Slovakia, you are either for Ukraine and the United States, or you are for Russia. There's nothing in between. And once you start to discuss that, okay, maybe there is really something what this international so-called security system is doing wrong, you are suddenly treated like you would be some conspirator or some pro-Russian whatever person. And this is something which is really difficult these times, because we are in a war. It's here, it's very close to us, and maybe it will spread much more than it is now. And it's becoming really difficult to see nuances and also to talk about nonviolent methods. But I've seen very interesting studies about nonviolent action and various movements in Ukraine, which is really like a war country. And these people are able to raise their voice and try to do various activities and actions for protecting human rights, for protecting even dialogue and many other aspects. Nature, protection of nature, protection of animals. Nobody thinking that in war also animals are under threat, and not wild animals and pets who escaped from the places where people are not living anymore. And these are very beautiful examples of compassion and of also nonviolent action, which is possible even in tragic situation.
You're so right. Like, it is very powerful to build on these experiences that people have and know. So we could hope that everyone has had some kind of experience of compassion, some kind of action that they took on behalf of someone else. And if you can build on that, that's very, very helpful. I mean, sometimes in trainings, we talk about this example that at the very base of thinking about being nonviolent in your life or having a nonviolence stance, if somebody hits you, right, and just hauls off and punches you, and you don't hit them back, then what happens? I mean, in a classroom, people will say, oh, they'll hit you again. Okay, they might hit you again, but if you don't hit them back, what you're doing is creating a moment of possibility where something else can happen. And a lot of this work is about creating a moment for alternatives, right? And it creates a moment. Right now, we're in a moment where there is incredible polarization or around the war in Ukraine. In the United States, I'm sure, as you say, in Slovakia. But one of our jobs might just be to speak out, even if what we're saying is unpopular, and to support each other for speaking out, give ourselves the courage to speak out, to carve out another way. It is not black and white. It is not just support the US and Ukraine versus Russia, right? There are other ways of talking about it. You can both condemn Russia and condemn war. And we need to be able to openly and actively call out the cost of war, both to Ukraine, individuals, people on the ground, animals, whatever, as well as the global future that we share. And there was a particular moment here where we could have exposed the cost of investing in fossil fuel infrastructure and put a lot of these billions of dollars that are going into death and destruction into moving us towards a low fossil fuel economy, to moving us towards sustainable energy, which would have eliminated maybe one of the causes for the war, right? And built up another way of taking care of people that was more appropriate ecologically as well. And so I think you're absolutely right, knowing the history of resistance, making space for these other conversations, understanding that there's never just a dichotomy. It's never just male or female. It's never just black and white. It's never just war or no war. There's like a whole spectrum of things to talk about. And in our culture, those forces that want to control people are often trying to set it up as an either or situation. And as activists, one of the basic tenets of nonviolent resistance or people power is that you're willing to speak out even when what you're saying is unpopular. You're willing to speak truth to power. And so holding on to that and supporting each other in that work is ever critical.
Yeah, but also we can speak about the limits or boundaries of nonviolence. You already started at the beginning that, here in Slovakia, when there is some rally or public gathering, and suddenly people are smashing cars or shop windows, or they are painting something on buildings, it's like damaging property, right? It's not damaging living beings, but just property. people consider it as a violent thing because attack on things which belongs to somebody, either is a private person or city or the government, that is very insulting and
Yeah.
they consider is violent. So can you comment on this a little
Oh,
bit?
yes, definitely. We
In
have
the
these
US, you have
conversations.
it a little bit different.
No, we have almost the same thing because in the United States, people fetishize property, right? They
Mhm.
think property almost as if it was a god. Now, around the world, people also understand that massive accumulation of property is akin to theft, right? It's almost the embodiment of the violence of wealth, that people who have so much property at the expense of other people's lives are embodying violence. And so the story about property is fascinating, or property destruction is fascinating. Many people here will not be able to hear what you're working on if you destroy property because of this approach. All they can see is that you've destroyed property, and they're not willing to hear your story about protecting a forest or protecting people or whatever it is. However, the stories that happen are very interesting. For example, when the revolution started in Egypt, the Tahrir Square Revolution, one of the first things that happened is that there were, 350 police stations destroyed and burned to the ground within the first couple of days of that revolution, because the police stations were seen as representatives of the violence of the state, right? And still, that revolution is widely touted, even in the United States, as a nonviolent revolution, even though there was such massive property destruction. And so the stories that we tell are critical about this as well. We have in the United States, and there's many examples where property destruction has been done here and people have been targeted as terrorists because of it in the United States, as well as property destruction has been done here and it has moved communities to make massive changes in their policies or policing. And as a person who is an active trainer and practitioner of nonviolent resistance in the United States, I recommend that people think very hard about whether or not property destruction will advance or derail their movement.
Can you give an example on this?
Yeah.
Good or bad example from your practice?
Well, I'll have a really simple thing maybe that helps bring it. So, during the anti-corporate globalization movement in the United States, where people were protesting the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, there was a huge demonstration in Seattle in 1999. And there were many shop windows broken and cars set on fire and things like this. And it was used as a way to say that the movement was not genuine, that it was made up of terrorists or thugs or people who were just out to smash things up. And the reality is, of course, it was a very small percentage of people who were doing this work, and that the media covered the demonstrations because a lot of it was exciting or quote unquote violence or involved property destruction. I would say there was no harm done to humans by the protesters within those demonstrations. The violence to people was all done by police authorities on the ground. And we saw this repeated in Black Lives Matter movement recently and in many other things, where the violence is really the part of the state who want to protect their structural ways of doing things, the structural violence of the system. And so what we do say to people is that when you are planning something that might involve property destruction, you have to take into account how the mainstream media will portray you and how you open yourself up, you make yourself vulnerable to infiltration by the authorities, who will then use your story against the movement in general. And that's what happens in the United States. And it's, one of the things that we counsel people to do is to be very careful, number one, like I said, and number two, we are not responsible for, the nonviolent action movement that maybe doesn't engage in property destruction is not responsible for those who do engage in property destruction. That property destruction and our protest mechanisms, whether they're the same or different, are all results of working against the structural violence of the system. And so if we want to stop people from doing things that we don't like people smashing things up, then what we need to do is change the structural system, change the violence of the system. And I think that that's really an important piece to talk about. Like, you're not going to find me condemning people's choice of tactics. It may not be something that is appropriate for me to do because I think that it costs our movement too much, but the condemnation is squarely on the top of the structural violence of the system.
Yeah, because one part of this nonviolent strategic action is to expose the violence of the state, or on the other side, which we are trying to change, that, okay, let's see how the state, the representative of the state, are violent and what they are doing to people, and somehow show it to the public.
Right. And this has to be really
which may
important.
be very risky, but it works in many
well,
cases.
And if what you're trying to do is stop nuclear arms shipments from traveling on a train to go to be shipped out to sea, you might pull up the train tracks. That is also property destruction, but it's direct intervention. Whereas I say to people, if what you want to do is take down a corporation, and what you do is you get a brick and you throw the brick through the corporation's window and you break the window, are you successful? No, the corporation's just going to put the window back. But if you have a brick and what you want to do is break a window, and you throw the brick through the window and you break the window, then you are successful. So there's a whole strategic analysis of what you're trying to do that has to be involved with the tactics that you choose.
Yeah, and this would be the topic for another podcast, to go much more in depth in various ways and tactics. And you really, and your organization, Beautiful Trouble, is actually wonderful name for an organization. You collected enormous knowledge and really extremely rich experience from all over the world in your books and in your website. And we will also put a link and reference in the description below this podcast. And I think it's very inspirative, because it's not only from the US, but really from various countries all over the globe. And that's really something. And we can see that this experience shows that there are plenty of ways how to work, from funny to serious to peaceful, and maybe some which takes courage and risk. And this is maybe my last question, because the last year you were here and you were training us in PDCS, and also you spent some time with people who were active as activists in Slovakia, in For Decent Slovakia movement, but also some other activities, youth activities, and various public movements. And I remember your reflection when we were discussing together, that you were saying that you Slovak people are very careful of taking risk, that you are very much trying to get things on smooth way. And that was very interesting observation for me.
Yes, I remember this, and it was really a pleasure to be with you and with the other folks I met in Slovakia. I'll say one thing about Beautiful Trouble, and really do encourage people to go look at the resources at beautifultrouble.org. Our thing is that we try to make revolution irresistible. That's Tony K. Bambara, the writer, said. And so context is incredibly important, and that's leading into what I'll say about Slovakia. So the idea, the superpower of Beautiful Trouble, or about any of these resources, or about strategic thinking, is that whatever the stories are, whatever the tactics are, the theories, the principles, making them accessible to you in your own context is the key here. And so looking at Slovakia, like, you're an incredibly new country. And I think, of course, there was great risk-taking and great courage shown, what was it now, 30 years ago, 40 years? How old is the country? It's very young.
30 years.
30 years. So very young, younger than me by a long shot. And so I think at that point, understanding the history of where the country has been and the desire to put in place and to solidify, if you will, you're just in that phase, possibly of solidifying the gains, and understanding very clearly now You have a society that has a lot of benefits. You are fairly well off. I mean, society in comparison to some of your neighbors, especially, and some of the other places in the world that we look at that have, very low income, very low social services. You have a lot to offer. And so people are, perhaps looking at what they might risk if they try to make change or they shake the boat. We're in that phase of like our middle age almost of Slovakia, of like, how do we solidify these gains without losing anything? Because we are now in a more comfortable place. And so it means that we need to think about how we make change, perhaps in more creative ways. Maybe it's less of a direct confrontation. Maybe it's more of a creative, innovative, or around the bend kind of way to think about how do we do future work that will institute or herald in, new ways of doing things that will be less oppressive, less sexist, less racist, less homophobic. And this is not to call out Slovakia. This is the challenge that we all face. I think the work that you do I'm an activist, educator, trainer, and I think that training and education is probably the most powerful thing that we can do together collectively to prepare for the work that we need to do and to support each other in taking courageous steps.
Yeah, but at the same time, we have to try things, because when we only train it in the room, so it's one part, but at the same time, I would really encourage us as Slovak people, and also in general, that we really need to try things in practice so that we know what works and what doesn't work. And I can say I'm also very proud of my country at the beginning of war in Ukraine, when there was massive wave of refugees coming here. And we really helped people, communities, the state was kind of not the best organized, but NGOs and cities and villages and individual people were really, really very much mobilized and involved in this help. And that's something which was unique for us. And maybe I was a little bit sarcastic saying that Ukrainian people are lucky that they are blue-eyed and blonde. But maybe when we learned how to help blue-eyed and blonde people, that next time we can help also somebody who is less blue-eyed and less blonde. And that it's an experience, that is something that moves us forward. And there is something we already can be proud of.
Yeah, this is so great. And the thing is about training and education is it should be experiential, right? And I remember even in the workshops that we did, very specifically talking about violence on the street that you might encounter, actually role-playing reaction to that so that people have a muscle memory, a body memory of what it feels like to intervene and how to do it in a more safer way. Maybe you can't be completely safe. Obviously, there's some risk always, but how do you actually do it in a way that could be less dangerous and have practice doing it? And I love this idea of practicing in real life. When the war started, you took care of people who were in need, and that is a history to be proud of. And you can call on it in the future. It's like that whole idea of, nonviolent action to begin with. If you practice it in your life, then you know how to use it later, hopefully. I mean, there's all kinds of psychological studies too about violence and violent response. If you experience violence in your life, if you experience abuse as a child, you are more likely without intervention to repeat that violence when you have children or to take violence out on other people in your life. And so we know that we can intervene. We know that we can help each other see alternative ways of addressing conflict, of addressing issues in our lives. And if we do train people, if we do practice, and if we do put these into place in the entrepreneurial world, they say fail forward, fail fast, right? Try things out and see what happens, and hopefully do it in a way that will have good results.
Yeah, that's a wonderful ending of our talk. So thank you, Nadine, very much. And really, I wish you success in your work. And it's always very inspirative. And I hope we will talk next time, you being in Slovakia, and we can have another talk together about things which are happening in America, in Slovakia, all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Zuzá. It's really a pleasure to take this time to talk about violence and nonviolence and strategic nonviolent action, and to help people think about the full spectrum of this work, not just the big wars and guns that we see on the streets, but how we ourselves can do little steps that then expose the systemic problems and lead us on a path to a better future, more healthier, peaceful future. Thanks so much for having me and for all the work that you do in Slovakia and all over.
Thank you again.
Conflict matters. It can destroy and hurt, but it can also bring a new quality into our lives. Thank you for being with us.